Hello viewers, you're watching Krasmodo channel. All kinds of engines have been installed on motorcycles, both by type and by layout. If we focus on internal combustion engines, or more precisely, on their architecture, then during the evolution of motorcycle technology, a number of power units have become typical for two-wheeled machines. These include single-cylinder, V-type, inline, and some boxer engines. However, history records cases of much more complex engines being installed in motorcycle frames. The radial or star-shaped engine is originally an aviation unit. This design, for a combination of reasons, is the most suitable for an aircraft. You might be surprised, but a number of motorcycles were equipped with such an engine. I invite you to hear a few words about motorcycles with star-shaped engines. Make yourself comfortable, grab something to snack on, it's going to be interesting. First, let's figure out what a radial engine is and also dive a bit into its history, when it appeared and where it found application. So, a radial or star-shaped engine is an internal combustion piston engine whose cylinders are arranged in radial spokes around a single crankshaft at equal angles. One of the important differences between a radial engine and other piston engines is the design of the crank mechanism. In a star-shaped engine, one connecting rod is the main one, while the others are auxiliary and are attached to the main rod around its periphery. A similar solution can sometimes be found in V-type engines. A special case of a star-shaped engine is the rotary engine, in which the crankshaft is the stationary element and everything else rotates around its axis. In some sources, you may come across the name rotor engine for such an engine. However, to avoid confusion with the design of Felix Wankel's engine, I will use only the term rotary from here on in the story. To achieve the required power characteristics, a radial engine may consist of more than one star-shaped section. Usually, four-stroke radial engines have an odd number of cylinders in one section. This is due to the optimal firing order in the cylinders. An odd number allows the spark to be delivered to every other cylinder. In a 5-cylinder star engine, the firing order is 1, 3, 5, 2, 4. Then we return to the start of the cycle with the first cylinder. If an even number of cylinders were used, an even ignition cycle would be impossible. However, there are designs with an even number of cylinders in a section. For example, the modern ZOKHI aircraft engine has 4 cylinders in one section, but it's a 2-stroke diesel. The main disadvantage of the radial engine design is the possibility of oil leaking into the lower cylinders. The rotary engine design has several disadvantages, including higher loads on the crankcase from centrifugal forces, which means that the rotary engine has a structural limit determined by the strength of the alloys. Such a setup has a large gyroscopic moment, which negatively affects the handling of both the airplane and the motorcycle. High oil use results from difficulty pumping it from the rotating crankcase. It's no secret that radial engines were widely used in piston aviation. Some believe this engine type entered motorcycle production from this industry. This statement is partly true. A number of motorcycle designs with this engine were definitely inspired by the spirit of aviation. And yes, the radial engine was originally developed for aviation. However, if you delve into history, you'll find that the stationary radial engine has an even older radial ancestor. The first radial rotary engine with a stationary crankshaft was invented well before the Wright brothers' 1903 flight. and it was not originally intended as a power unit for aviation. Such an engine was first installed in the front wheel of a tricycle, and a little later in the rear wheel of a motorcycle. We should thank the French inventor Félix Théodore Mille for this invention, as he was one of the pioneers of motorcycle engineering. In 1887, he invented a 5-cylinder rotary engine, patenting it a year later. In 1889, Mille installed it in a tricycle's front wheel. Such an engine is ideal for installation in a wheel. You fix the crankshaft to the fork or swing arm, so the wheel and engine rotate together. The problem with this installation option is providing power to the engine in the large gyroscopic moment of the motor wheel. In 1892, Mille installed this engine in the rear wheel of a bicycle, thus creating the first motorcycle in human history with a multi-cylinder engine. But even in the year the Mille tricycle debuted at the Paris exhibition, aviation pioneers noticed this engine, because such a unit had a high specific power relative to its weight, exactly what is needed for an aircraft, high power and low weight. So in 1889, Lawrence Hargreaves first developed a rotary engine using compressed air and intended to use it for flight. However, poor material processing and heavy weight led to the project's failure. In the early 1890s, the American Stephen Marius Balzer took notice of this configuration. He built a 3-cylinder rotary engine and in 1894 equipped a car with it. However, in the second half of the decade, he went bankrupt trying to build larger engines and while working on the Langley Aerodrome. In 1899, Albert de Dion created a 4-cylinder rotary engine, which was never installed on any airplane. However, no matter how difficult the first steps were, the rotary engine continued to develop and later became widely used on airplanes in the 1910s and, in particular, during World War I. Companies like Gnome, Laren, Clerge, Bentley, and others produced these engines. However, due to a number of drawbacks that I have already mentioned earlier, the main ones being limitations in size and rotational speed because of the strength limit of the crankcase and the limit on the amount of fuel-air mixture that can be drawn in through the hollow crankshaft. Rotary engines gave way to radial engines with stationary cylinders and a rotating crankshaft. The last rotary designs could be found in aviation in the early 1920s, and the British 9-cylinder Bentley BR2, developed at the end of World War I, is considered the most powerful engine of this configuration. And in fact, the BR2's performance figures were at the limit. It was impossible to further increase displacement, rotating mass, power, or speed. The 25-liter Bentley BR2 produced about 230 horsepower and weighed 220 kilograms. The first radial engine in history was built in 1901 by the American Charles Matthew Manley, based on the developments of Stephen Marius Balzer's rotary engine, and with his support. Many engineers whom Manley spoke with during his trip to Europe in 1900 told him that the rotary design was hopeless, and soon he himself came to believe these claims. Manley created a truly revolutionary engine. The engine was completed fairly quickly, but it turned out to be not powerful enough, about 8 to 10 horsepower. Charles expected a power output of around 12. The new engine had cooling problems. The rotary engine, thanks to its self-rotation, didn't even require fins, but the stationary cylinders overheated quickly. Manley solved the problem by equipping the engine with water cooling. Soon, the unit was producing 12 to 16 horsepower. Encouraged by his success, he increased the displacement of his 5-cylinder creation and brought the power up to 52 horsepower. It was the most powerful lightweight engine at that time. In 1903, Manley installed this unit on an airplane and made 2 attempts during the second half of that year to make the first flight in human history on an airplane. The first time, on October 7th, the glider turned out to be very fragile, and the airplane crashed without taking off. The second test flight on December 8 ended when the airplane crashed into the Potomac River. Manley survived in both cases. 9 days later, on December 17, 1903, two brothers with the last name Wright won this race. One of the early designs of the radial engine was a 3-cylinder unit by the Italian engineer Alessandro Anzani. Anzani was an avid aircraft builder and motorcycle enthusiast who installed a W-shaped semi-radial 3-cylinder engine on motorcycles. By World War I's end, an interesting situation emerged. Rotary radial engines had reached their development limits. In fact, all engines with a stationary crankshaft and more than 160 horsepower were unsuccessful. Star-shaped stationary engines, from the beginning of their history in 1901 up to 1919, remained in the shadow of their relative. Such early designs suffered from overheating except for the very rare engines with liquid cooling. Early aviation was slow, and natural airflow was not enough for such an engine. Most radial engines had air cooling, but one of the most successful early radial engines and the earliest stationary design created for World War I combat aircraft was the series of 9-cylinder water-cooled radial engines, Somsen 9Z, which were produced in large numbers. By 1917-1918, the development of radial engines lagged behind the inline and V-type engines of that time. In these years, 400 horsepower V-type engines became dominant in British and French military aircraft, while Germans kept pace with their inline 6-cylinder engines. But the gradual development of materials science and processing in the 1920s made it possible to create an efficient radial engine. The Americans made a significant contribution to the improvement of this engine in the first half of the 1920s. In 1921, the United States Navy announced that they would only order aircraft with air-cooled radial engines. As early as 1922, with financial support from the Navy, Charles Lawrence developed the J-1 engine, which ran continuously for 300 hours during tests instead of the 50 that had been predicted. At the insistence of the Navy, the Wright Aeronautical Corporation bought Lawrence's company, and subsequent engines were produced under the Wright name. In 1925, the J-5 engine appeared, which was called the first truly reliable aircraft engine. In the same year, the Pratt & Whitney Company was founded, which over the next 25 years would build 175,000 radial engines. In Britain, the Bristol Airplane Company would succeed in this field. Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union started by creating licensed versions of Armstrong Siddeley, Bristol, Wright, and Pratt & Whitney radial engines, and then they mastered the production of their own engines. France continued developing various rotary designs, but also produced engines based on Bristol designs. The industry of building radial engines entered its golden age, and the pinnacle of engineering would be the creation of huge high-performance engines. For example, the Wright R3350 Duplex Cyclone is an 18-cylinder engine with a 54.9-liter displacement and 3,700 horsepower output. A 28-cylinder, 4-row engine with a displacement of 71.5 liters and a power output of 4,300 horsepower. Among domestic engines, it's worth mentioning Yakovlev M501, built in 1953. This 42-cylinder turbo diesel produced 6,205 horsepower. With the advent of the jet engine, piston engines gradually began to give way, and the golden age of radial engines came to an end in the 60s. I won't go any further into aircraft engineering. Aviation enthusiasts can learn much more from the Aviasmatry or Skyships channels. And we will take a closer look at the topic of motorcycles with such engines. As we approach the moment to discuss motorcycles with radial engines, I want to structure this material into 3 chapters. In the first chapter, we'll cover designs with a rotary radial engine, meaning all designs with a rotating engine in the wheel. In the second chapter, there will be motorcycles with, let's say, a stationary radial engine, and in the third, designs with a semi-radial engine. Yes, there are such ones as well. And so we've come back to the father of radial engines and the creator of the first motorcycle with a multi-cylinder engine. Let me repeat myself a little. Felix Mille received a patent for his rotary engine in 1888, and he built it a year earlier. In 1889 at the World's Fair in Paris, a tricycle designed by Mille with this engine in the front wheel made its debut. And in 1892, Felix installed the engine in the rear wheel of a bicycle, thus creating a motorcycle, the first motorcycle in history with a radial engine. The 5-cylinder unit, with a displacement of 1,925 cubic centimeters, produced a maximum of 1.2 horsepower at 360 revolutions per minute and allowed a speed of about 35 kilometers per hour. Fuel consumption was around 3 liters per 100 kilometers. The structure weighed about 60 kilograms, with the engine weighing 10. The rear wheel fender served as the fuel tank. In 1894, Alexander Darracq acquired the rights to manufacture this motorcycle. A year later, Mille entered the Paris-Bordeaux-Paris race on his motorcycle, but it failed to finish. The machine was hard to handle, so its production was discontinued that year. Felix Mille's motorcycle was doomed to obscurity, but at least one example has survived to this day. 10 years later, another interesting motorcycle design with a rotary engine would appear in the world. There was a man named Charles Benjamin Redrop, a very significant figure in aviation and axial engine design. As a youth, Charlie was curious about engineering, which later became his life's purpose. After visiting the United States, he returned to Barrie and founded the Barrie Motor Company. In 1904, a motorcycle with a Redrop rotary, 2-cylinder engine appeared. Barrie motorcycles were produced in small numbers in 1904 and 1905. The 200cc rotary boxer engine was rigidly mounted by its crankshaft in the split frame, see the engine diagram, and actively rotated there, transmitting torque to the rear wheel. In 1905, the frame design was slightly modified, and the engine was placed lower to reduce the motorcycle's center of gravity. The machine was not successful, so it was produced in extremely limited numbers. But don't say goodbye to Charles Redrop just yet. His name will come up more than once in this story. The next motorcycle with a rotary engine appeared in the 1920s in Germany. This is the well-known Megola. This motorcycle was built by Hans Meixner, Fritz Guckerl, and Otto Landgraf. Actually, the name is derived from the first letters of each surname. Megola also has an interesting backstory. In 1918, the company Gocarella, with the participation of Meixner, built a prototype motorcycle called Pax, with a 3-cylinder rotary radial engine in the rear wheel. The power was about 2.5 horsepower. Such an engine for testing had been built 2 years earlier. It is not known for sure whether Gockerl developed such an engine on his own or was inspired by the work of Felix Mille or the patent of the American Charles Duryea. A few words about Charles's patent. In 1901, Duryea patented the design of a 2-cylinder engine installed in a bicycle wheel. It is noteworthy that both Duryea's unit and Gockerl's design have one thing in common. The wheel is rigidly attached to the engine, while the crankshaft is connected to the fork or swing arm through a planetary gear. The engine is still rotary, but with a twist. I'll explain as I follow Megle's story. In late 1918, the Pax motorcycle with a 3-cylinder engine was renamed Mego. Around the same time, Otto Landgraf joined the project. The guys, hoping to promote their design, signed a legal contract with Marswerke from Nuremberg. By 1919, the agreement ended, causing Landgraf significant financial loss. But this unpleasant event did not stop the guys. In their workshop, they put together a more powerful 5-cylinder power unit with a displacement of 640 cubic centimeters. By 1920, the Magola prototype with a rear wheel engine was ready. Notice the inscriptions on the Magola prototype's advertising poster. Weight, 70 kilograms, power, 6.5 horsepower, and a range of 600 kilometers on a single tank. During design and construction, several problems arose, leading the three creators to decide it was more practical to install the engine in the front wheel. The 640cc radial 5-cylinder engine was modified to increase its power, which reached 14 horsepower. A planetary gear was necessary for the engine because the calculated wheel's speed at maximum velocity was 600 revolutions per minute, while the engine produced maximum power at 3,600. We have a gear ratio of 1:6. The crankcase was firmly attached to the wheel, and the crankshaft rotated 6 times for each wheel revolution in the opposite direction. This design made it possible to significantly reduce the gyroscopic moment of the motor wheel, which weighed about 30 kilograms. The Magola's chassis was also unconventional, made of load-bearing curved riveted steel sheets. The rider sat on a comfortable saddle with a backrest, or in the sport versions, on a regular motorcycle seat of that time. The Magola touring model featured rear leaf spring suspension. In fact, the Magola had no gearbox, no clutch, and no neutral. Stopping required turning off the engine, and it was restarted by pushing. In only one gear, the motorcycle cruised at 20 kilometers per hour and reached a top speed of 80. The motorcycle turned out to be quite inconvenient for city use. After all, it lacked a clutch mechanism. But on the racetrack, Magola was in its element. In 1924, Tony Bauhofer won the 500cc class on a Magola at the first German road racing championship. For racing, the Magola was made lighter and equipped with a 1-to-5 planetary gear. They also tested different front wheel sizes. The maximum speed achieved by the Magola was 142 kilometers per hour. A 6-cylinder engine was planned for the Magola, but it was never produced. The machine was produced until 1925, and about 2,000 of these beauties rolled off the assembly line. Only about 10 examples have survived to this day in fully working condition. The next motorcycle can be called a modified Magola. This elegant machine is called Friedenstaube, which literally means dove of peace. That's the name given to it by its creators, 2 German engineers, Robert Killinger and Walter Freund. However, you will often find this motorcycle under the name Killinger und Freund. It took Robert and Walter 3 years to create this unique design, which they presented to the public at the Munich exhibition in 1938. Killinger and Freund can rightfully be considered the successor to the Magola, since during development, Robert Killinger closely collaborated with the creator of the Magola, Fritz Gockerl. Walter Freund designed the motorcycle frame and overall look. Killinger and Freund featured a 3-cylinder 2-stroke engine with a 600 cubic centimeter displacement. Like the Magola, this prototype used a planetary transmission, but engineers took it even further. Take a look at this photograph. This radial engine doesn't have a common crankshaft. Each cylinder has its own, which drives the small gears of the planetary system. There were 2 planetary gears with different ratios. A shifting mechanism was provided, which means it was basically a 2-speed gearbox, but most importantly, there was space for a clutch in the engine design. And yes, this machine was positioned as the ideal city motorcycle. The front wheel weighed 45 kilograms and the whole motorcycle about 130. The maximum speed was 130 kilometers per hour. Killinger and Freund successfully passed the test in 1938 and was basically ready to go into production. The testers noted the smooth ride, good handling even on deep sand, and minimal engine vibrations. The mass production of this technological marvel was prevented by the war. The motorcycle was produced as a single unit. In 1945, it was taken out of Germany by the Americans. The original motorcycle is still around to this day. There are also known cases of replicas of this machine being made. This model marked the end of motorcycles with rotary radial engines. Now let's take a look at two-wheeled machines with a stationary star-shaped engine in their frame. There is an opinion that the first such machine was the Verdal, supposedly released in 1910. However, this motorcycle was built much later, a whole 100 years later, in 2010. This is, let's say, a modern take on what a motorcycle with a radial engine from those years might have looked like. In the 1900s, Frenchman Louis Verdel sold bicycles, cars, motorcycles, and more. In 1912, he founded a factory for producing aircraft engines called L'Aron, which soon, in 1915, merged with Gnome to create the Gnome-Rhone brand. Louis Verdel did not produce motorcycles. The famous Verdel motorcycle with a 5-cylinder radial engine of 750 cc was built in Lancashire as an engineering experiment and was later purchased by Sammy Miller, in whose collection it is now. Originally, the motorcycle was black, but later it was repainted in white and green. But the very first motorcycle with a stationary radial engine can truly be considered this René Gillet from 1911. Its 4-cylinder engine had a displacement of 2.6 liters and produced a maximum of 22 horsepower. The motorcycle was meant for competitions and was apparently built as a one-off. Notably, motorcycle manufacturing, like aircraft manufacturing, was rapidly developing in the 1910s. This period is notable because construction patterns were not yet established. Each engineer created according to his own imagination, and over time, society chose the most viable designs among them. Among motorcycle builders of those years, there was much talk about the possibility of using radial engines, but very few dared to attempt such experiments. The one who truly took this idea seriously was Charles Redrop. His experiments with radial engines did not end with the 1904 motorcycle model. In 1913, Redrop moved to Leeds, where he designed and built engines for Vickers airplanes. After World War I, Charles and Leeds motorcycle maker Monty Beaumont developed a 3-cylinder radial engine with 309 cc displacement and 2.75 horsepower. The motorcycle was made from 1919 to 1922. Charles was a fan of engine building, so the production of motorcycles was entrusted to third-party companies. In 1921, the rights to produce the engine were acquired by the British company Radial Engine Company, which produced motorcycles under that name. Between 1919 and 1922, around 153-cylinder Red Road motorcycles were made. In this photograph, you can see an experimental 6-cylinder motorcycle model from 1921. As you can see, the engine consisted of 2 sets of 3 cylinders each, combined together. In 1922, the more powerful Cyclone engine was developed. It was produced by a company called SYS Engineering from Leeds. This unit retained the 3-cylinder layout, had a displacement of 963 cubic centimeters, and produced a maximum of 7.5 horsepower. Charles Redrop worked in engine manufacturing all his life. In the following decade, he developed engines for companies such as Avro, Vickers, Crossley, and Bristol. And during World War II, he participated in the development of the bouncing bomb, which the British Air Force used to destroy dams. He returned to motorcycles in 1948. That year, Charlie, together with his son, created another motorcycle with a radial engine. He installed a 3-cylinder engine with a displacement of 250 cubic centimeters into a Royal Enfield chassis. The cylinders of this engine were arranged in a horizontal plane. The prototype still exists and is displayed at the Sammy Miller Museum. Regarding the whole topic of building motorcycles with radial engines, attempts to launch such machines into mass production correlate with the early history of motorcycle manufacturing. This covers the period up to and including the 1930s. So what am I actually getting at? Motorcycles with radial engines made after World War II are all either limited custom builds or replicas of older models. At the same time, we have a significant gap in time. After Charles Redrop's motorcycle in 1948, stars on motorcycles were forgotten for a long time, for about 60 years. In custom building, this engine layout was only remembered in the 21st century. I can't say with absolute certainty that this is completely true. However, after working on this material for a month and a half, I didn't come across a single similar motorcycle from the early 50s to the 2000s. For a complete picture, let's take a look at 21st century motorcycles with sprockets in the frame. This red custom bike is called Red Baron, Krasny Baron. This motorcycle is the creation of the German enthusiast Franco Ole, who spent 18 months building it and presented it to the public in 2013. The engine of the Red Baron is a 9-cylinder Rotec radial R3600. Rotec is a modern Australian company that produces radial engines for light aviation. R3600 refers to its engine displacement in cubic centimeters. The maximum power is 150 horsepower at 2,500 revolutions per minute. Through an angular gearbox, the power is transmitted to a 4-speed Harley-Davidson gearbox and then to the rear wheel. In other respects, the motorcycle refers to the personality of the pilot Manfred von Richthofen. His Fokker Dr. I triplane was painted red, which is why Manfred got his nickname, the Red Baron. Several of the following choppers, built during the 2010s, are based on the same engine. This 7-cylinder engine from Australian company Rotec has a 2.8-liter displacement and produces 110 horsepower. This is John Levy's, the American Cosmic Chrome motorcycle. And here is the creation of the Frenchman Frank Dupuis called Lazarus. This is the Blackjack motorcycle by Scott Hammond. This creation is called Radial Hell by Jesse James. This motorcycle is Lucky 7 by Ollie Staffold. Or here's the Ion Gatsby by Paul Yane. The same engine, and each master's vision of what their chopper with such an engine should look like. All of these are showstoppers and very poorly suited for riding. To me, despite their differences, they're the same, and I won't go on and on about them. We have more interesting creations on our list. Here's a much more interesting motorcycle, the Bisty 3, or just B3, by Kevin Diesheiser. He built the 3-cylinder radial power unit with a 2.4-liter displacement himself, using some parts from a Moto Guzzi engine and others from Aviation. He ended up with a powerful machine delivering 100 horsepower and 135 newton meters of torque. The B-Tree debuted in 2015. In 2016, at the Indonesian Custom Fest, Yusuf Adib Mustafa from the Psycho Engine Workshop presented the Naga Lima motorcycle. It took the workshop about 2 years to build this 5-cylinder custom, and the base was a 2002 Honda Tiger motorcycle. Another similar concept creation appeared in 2021 after 2.5 years of engineering research. In November 2021, Czech Marek Foltis proudly presented his completed project, Bestella 500, to the world. The engine of this motorcycle is a radial 2-section 10-cylinder engine. By the way, the name Bestella literally translates as 2-star, which fully reflects the concept. As Marek Foltis himself admits, the main goal was to create his own engine. Another requirement was a large number of cylinders. The radial layout seemed the most suitable to Foltis. According to Czech law, in order to keep the motorcycle legal and allow it to be used on public roads, the frame, suspension, and brakes had to remain stock. The Jawa Perak motorcycle served as the base, with engine dimensions adjusted to fit the Jawa frame. The cylinders for the engine were taken from 50 cubic Jawa motorcycles, and to increase the power, 5 Root superchargers were used. At the time of its debut in 2021, the power was limited to 60 horsepower at 6,500 revolutions per minute. The machine's theoretical maximum power is 120 horsepower. The calculated top speed is 220 km/h, but the actual speed is about 100 km/h. Marek is not advised to test the top speed, since the chassis comes from the first half of the 50s and is clearly not designed for such heroics. And this masterpiece wasn't created for that anyway. 2.5 years of work on Bastella brought successes, failures, and many technical challenges. We ended up with a beautiful motorcycle that, unlike many customs with a star-shaped engine, looks neat and well put together. This Peugeot motorcycle with a 9-cylinder radial engine is a modern creation by the motorcycle enthusiast Bohair. This motorcycle was built on the chassis of a 1930s Peugeot racing motorcycle model. A 9-cylinder engine with a displacement of only 100 cubic centimeters, running on methanol, is installed in its frame. The motorcycle's top speed is about 11 km/h. Among the latest custom projects, the Radial Nerve motorcycle is worth mentioning. This 7-cylinder motorcycle was built by Marcellus De La Rosa in 2023. This machine is powered by a 7-cylinder radial engine with a 360cc displacement. On the right side of the engine, there's an aluminum fan that helps cool it. The power unit is started with a Kickstarter, but as a tribute to aviation traditions, it can also be started by hand using a crank starter. This interesting project has been developed by the efforts of the Australian companies Shepherd Motorcycles, Kennedy Motorcycles, and Radial Motion since 2021. The goal is to set a speed record for a radial engine motorcycle. The project, Low Flying Object, stands for Low Flying Object. The motorcycle is designed for a top speed of over 320 kilometers per hour. Radial Motion is developing a 2.1-liter, 3-cylinder engine for this project. At the moment, judging by the posts of these companies on Facebook, work on the engine and the motorcycle prototype is ongoing. This means that there will surely be news soon about the presentation of this machine and the results of the speed run. The author of the channel, Let's Learn Something, made an interesting homemade project. This channel is quite well known in motorcycle circles for building various engines from parts of the Chinese copy of the Kabovsky engine. So one of the episodes is dedicated to building a 3-cylinder radial engine. Let's finish the conversation about radial engines on motorcycles with a couple of concepts. This one is called the JRL Sport Bike. And this concept was developed by the same guys who built several custom bikes with Roadtech engines. This is a Moto Guzzi concept, but these are only renders made in a popular image editing program. That's all for the radial engine motorcycles. We're done. I don't rule out that I might have missed some one-off project, but overall, I've covered the history quite thoroughly. Now let's take a look at two-wheeled machines with a semi-radial engine. What is a semi-radial engine? The name speaks for itself. Basically, it's a radial engine with some of the cylinders removed. In literature, you may come across the terms fan-shaped or W-shaped. These engines could be found in early piston aviation. Besides aviation, they were also used on some motorcycles. Their peak popularity also occurred in the first third of the 20th century. The pioneer in this field was the Italian Alessandro Ambrogio Anzani. Anzani began producing motorcycles in 1905 in France. As a daredevil, Anzani loved racing and setting records on his machines. In 1906, a 3-cylinder engine was added to the motorcycle frame to boost power and win races. The 600cc version of the engine produced about 6 horsepower, while this 1,450cc engine produced about 12 horsepower. The outer cylinders were positioned at a 60-degree angle to the central one. In 1907, Andrei Grapperon showcased this motorcycle's potential on the flying kilometer, reaching 115 km/h. This Alcyon Boucher motorcycle was built in 1905 in France. Its three-cylinder engine was developed with the direct involvement of Alexander Anzani. And it so happened that the Boucher motorcycle was released a bit earlier than the same motorcycle by Anzani. However, without Alexander, this motorcycle would not have existed. The next machine emerged in 1908. This monster is the Asnault Pelterie motorcycle, and it was built for racing by Robert Albert Charles Eno Pelterie. Pelterie, like many other people mentioned in this story, was an aviator, an engine builder, and a daredevil. And to outdo the others like himself, he decided to build a powerful racing motorcycle. As a result, he ended up with this kind of cart with a 5-cylinder engine producing around 20 to 25 horsepower. The next unique motorcycle is from the Czech Republic. There was a little-known company called Torpedo, run by František Trojan and Alois Nagel. Torpedo motorcycle production began in 1905 and boomed within 3 years. The equipment sold rapidly and was exported worldwide. And in 1909, František and Alois presented probably the most interesting Czech motorcycle ever made, the racing model Torpedo Radial 4. The engine was a masterpiece of engineering. A semi-radial, 4-stroke, 4-cylinder, air-cooled engine with an angle of 36 degrees between each cylinder, with a cylinder bore of 73 millimeters and a piston stroke of 100. The engine had a 1,640 cc displacement and produced 1012 horsepower at 2,200 RPM. The maximum speed was 120 kilometers per hour, which made the semi-radial Torpedo the fastest Czech motorcycle of that time. The dry weight was 110 kilograms, and the tank held 8 liters of fuel. By the way, 3 years later, in 1912, these two even started building airplanes, with an engine similar to Anzani's design. The original one-off 4-cylinder motorcycle has not survived. Fortunately, some enthusiasts create replicas. An exact copy of the Torpedo 4 was built by the Czech Pavel Milanek, who spent about 2,500 hours creating this marvel. The process was very labor-intensive and complex, as only a few original photos and engine drawings remained. The Italian company Moto Guzzi remembered the semi-radial engine after a long time. Between 1981 and 1982, designer Lino Tanti developed the W103, a 3-cylinder engine prototype. It is known that the engine never went beyond the prototype stage and was never installed in any chassis. However, a little information about its characteristics has been preserved. It had a displacement of 992 cubic centimeters. The cylinders were set at an angle of 65 degrees to each other. The valves were operated by a cam mechanism in the crankcase and push rods going to the cylinder head. Nowadays, Jim Foiling managed to install a semi-radial 3-cylinder engine in a motorcycle, and quite successfully, Foiling 3 is produced in a small series. While working with Harley V-twins in the early 90s, Foiling got the idea to add a 3rd cylinder to the engine. He shared this idea with the bosses at Harley-Davidson, hoping for their help and support. Harley-Davidson was in no rush to break tradition and responded negatively. Therefore, Jim, committed to his idea, kept moving forward alone. He obtained patents for all his W3 engine designs, and in December 1999, he received a patent for a motorcycle design with such an engine. At the same time, he got approval for mass producing the fueling W3 motorcycle. The power unit is a crankcase to which 3 cylinders are attached at a 45-degree angle to each other. The displacement is 2,459 cubic centimeters. The maximum power of this monster is 150 horsepower, and the torque is 230 Newton meters. A 5-speed gearbox from Harley-Davidson is installed on the motorcycle. The top speed is 236 kilometers per hour. Jim Foiling's motorcycles hit the market in January 2001, priced at $30,000. The market received the machines with interest, and Jim was inspired to continue his work. However, in December 2002, at the age of 56, Foiling passed away after battling pancreatic cancer. Only 18 unique fueling W3 motorcycles were produced. His business still proudly uses the Foiling name. Now these bikes' prices have skyrocketed. On the official website, the engine is $100,000 and a motorcycle costs $250,000. It's not entirely clear whether these motorcycles are still being produced today or not. Let's sum it up. Motorcycles with a radial engine are an interesting page in history. As you can see, this engine type did not become common in two-wheeled vehicles due to its characteristics. In the 21st century, such motorcycles experienced a small revival, but for now, only in a few prototypes and custom builds. The engine from Radial Motion on the Low Flying Object project looks quite promising. However, it's unlikely to go into mass production, since competition from other motorcycle manufacturers with more traditional engine layouts for this type of machine will be very strong. At the beginning of working on this story, specifically at the point of the brief history of radial engines, I wanted to add another chapter about cars and tanks with radial engines after the 3 chapters about motorcycles. However, when I got to working on this chapter, I realized that it would be about another half hour of finished material. There will be a separate episode about these cars. Friends, at this point my story comes to an end. I hope I managed to explain this topic clearly and in an interesting way. And if you enjoyed the story, don't hesitate to be active on the channel. Share it or leave a comment. In general, you know everything yourself. If you want to support me financially, the details are in the description. Thank you very much. This was the Krasmodo channel. See you next time.